Okay, and we're delighted to have Anna. I asked her, Anna Lemler, and I asked her what her title was, and if I get it right, it's the Racial Equity Analyst, right? And she's going to talk to us about this initiative that Ann Arbor, the city of Ann Arbor, and Washtenaw County have put together and have started. And we're delighted to have her here.
Thank you.
Talking to us.
I appreciate it. Hi, everyone. So great to be here. So again, my name is Anna Lemler, and my title is Racial Equity Analyst of the county. I just started a few months ago. And yeah, thanks for having me here. I've been here, I think, as a participant before, a couple times, working formally with the DRC, and am a restorative justice practitioner myself, so I feel at home with you all. So I'm here to present about the One Community Initiative and just generally about the racial equity work that the county is kind of embarking on and getting some speed on. And then I have a brief PowerPoint, and then open to dialogue and questions and all of that. I'm also happy to answer any questions along the way. So your call if you want to jump in or if you want to hold your question until the end. So our working title right now, which has kind of actually just been edited a little bit, is that the initiative is called One Community, Advancing Racial Equity in Washtenaw County. It actually used to be, as of last week, Advancing Racial Equity in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County, but we've decided, but Ann Arbor, guess what, is a part of Washtenaw County. So we are just doing Washtenaw County. We also have plans this summer to build other partnerships with other areas and municipalities in the county, and so we're hoping that it'll be a much more collaborative initiative, and I can tell you more about that history of how that started.
Just a quick clarification. Could you just trace the origin of your position?
Sure. So the origin of my position is very simple, which is just that I started 3 months ago, and I'm actually just a temp employee with an 8-month contract. So it's technically over in November. And there has been no one that has solely been focusing just on racial equity.
So where did it begin, and what was its development?
It began, part of the history will probably cover that, but generally I think conversations started mainly at the end of last year, where I think people started to understand through a relationship with an organization that I'll talk about that Tony knows well, that actually, like, if we're going to do this, it's going to take a lot of resources and staff and time to really do it.
So they don't think it'll be...
What'd you say?
I was going to say I could give you a little bit of in terms of origins and how Washtenaw County came to...
Yeah, that's...
Yeah, how it came to that, and then recognize, and then in terms of recognition of the focus of now having someone solely focused on this particular initiative. Started with Washtenaw County getting involved. Well, you know what? Actually, the history is that.
Yeah, I think it's probably there.
Okay.
Yeah. I go back to 2015, so hopefully it'll be there. Yeah. Yes.
And one quick question, and you can just say yes or no.
Sure.
So you've got an 8-month contract. Does that mean that this program, that this initiative is at risk of ending when your contract is up?
So hopefully not. There are dreams and schemes for further work, not necessarily for me per se, but I just submitted a proposal for an office, like a department.
So the answer is yes.
Of the equity office. Yes, it should be.
We hope to prevent that, but yes, it is at risk.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's technically, like, budget processes will be happening within the next couple months, so yes. I can't say 100% sure, but that's the plan. Great. So what is equity? It is when neither a person's race or their address can predict outcomes in life. That is a general working definition that actually comes from a partner called GARE, who I'll talk about. So this is both a national pattern and also here locally, that there are disparate outcomes based on race and place. What creates racial equity, or how does it manifest, can be in a variety of ways. So I want to talk about, just very kind of broad stroke, 3 different forms of racism and how those show up, so that we can we're going to narrow in on one of those forms, and that's what we'll be talking about, and that's what this initiative is generally addressing. So racism can show up in both implicit and explicit ways, and it also can show up on these 3 different levels. So first, I want to make sure that we understand the difference of implicit and explicit. So sometimes, historically and currently, there may be some explicit discriminatory policies on institutional levels. So an explicit example might be that the police department refuses to hire people of color, right? That used to be legally allowed, and that is an example of an explicit institutional policy. An implicit one might be that the police department focuses on street-level drug arrests. So sometimes in our policies, it is not explicitly naming race, but it is their impact is affecting people of color at disproportionate rates than their counterparts of white people. This other example, so on an individual level, is that a police officer, an example for explicit, is a police officer calling someone an ethnic slur while arresting them. So very explicit, using a derogatory labeling of someone based in race. And then implicit could be that a police officer calls for backup more often when stopping a person of color. So their own implicit biases, they engage with someone who's a person of color, and they may call for backup, thinking that they're following typical protocol, but if we actually look at the data, then we're seeing actually that more backup is being called when engaging with a person of color. So that's an example of implicit bias. So these biases show up, this shows up in a variety of ways in these 3 different levels. So racism can show up on an individual level, an institutional level, or a structural level. So individual would be a prejudgment, bias, or discrimination by an individual based on race. So that is on a very individual to individual level, interpersonal level. Often when people are having conversations of race, especially for white folks, this can be a really scary place to be in, because when we're like, oh, racial equity initiative, people are like, oh no, I don't want to talk about race. I don't want to be called a racist. This is an uncomfortable conversation for me. This is about me as an individual. But that's actually not what we're focusing on. We're focusing on institutional racism, which is the policies, practices, and procedures that work better for white people than for people of color, often unintentionally or inadvertently. So this is important to acknowledge that our policies and practices, while they are not explicit, they can still have an impact that is inequitable for people of color. And then the third, which is a little more meta, is structural. So, or systemic is another word that people will use to describe that level, which is a history and current reality of institutional racism across all institutions, which then creates a system of negatively impacting communities of color. So we have the individual level, and then this institutional level, which creates this larger systemic level. And you see these wheels right here, which show that it's all interconnected. It's not separate. Individuals make up institutions, institutions make up systems, systems influence individuals, and it's all just cyclical, and it's messy, and it's all over. So this is just to try to add some clarity to what can be sometimes a complicated conversation, or we may not be educated on how to talk about racism. And so the focus for the work, for the racial equity work as it stands now, is this institutional level. So institutional racism can show up in a variety of ways. What we find, the research shows, that it impacts all of these different areas. It impacts housing, to education, to equitable development. And what we are also finding is that, and I wish I could be able to cite the source immediately, I should be able to do that, which is just that multiple sources and research are showing this, is that actually, especially for Black community members, that are indicators for like disparate outcomes or inequity are either staying the same or actually worsening. So from the 60s. So we actually are not making the progress that we should be when it comes to racial equity, and instead we're either stagnant, like, you know, educational outcomes might be the same, or the gap might be widening, and actually it's getting worse. So this is truly something of real urgency and crisis, I would say, in the fact that we really should be doing a lot of work, which is exactly what the county is now committing to doing, which is really wonderful. And a way that we can address that is by understanding how does it manifest and its impact on people in their lives, and then also what does that mean for us when this is a history, right? There's centuries of this being created, and now there's something that we can do about it. So what do we do? So the manifestations are that we see that jobs, and this is just nationally speaking, that jobs, an example is that, I'm not sure if people have heard about the study that came out recently about resumes. Has anyone heard about that? So they're finding that actually if people are discriminating based on just name, and so if it's a certain sounding type of name, that people are not getting jobs. And so what a practice that people have been doing now is actually to take off the name. so that you're just looking at the content. And people are finding that in HR policies that this is a way to potentially mitigate that. Housing, that there has been a history of redlining, which this is like, I believe, Detroit, and which is where areas that were where banks were investing or not investing. So a red line was literally drawn on a map to show where certain people of certain affluence and certain racial background could or could not live, which meant that people of color were excluded from being able to purchase land, from being able to invest, which then of course has a cumulative effect over the years of being able to gain wealth and then also be able to move like upward economic mobility. Healthcare, this is another example of infant mortality rates and other types of diseases and health outcomes. The criminal justice system, so mass incarceration, disproportionate outcomes by race. The environment, so which areas are like air pollution, which areas are, where is trash being dumped. Environmental justice, arts and culture, whose culture and what kind of arts are being funded or promoted, what kind of culture is not being invested in. Education, different outcomes with test scores, different outcomes with attendance. There are different policies like the school to prison pipeline or zero tolerance policies that I would imagine folks may be familiar with here. Equitable development, so which schools are being funded, kind of looking at infrastructure. So all of these things we find, all these indicators and areas we find we are finding racial inequity in them across the country. Yes?
This seems almost minor, but is transportation included in any way?
Yeah, transportation, yes.
Where is that?
And that might be under equitable development. So what areas, when we're thinking of infrastructure, where do we decide to develop? Yes, thanks, Joan. So the impacts of this, when looking at kind of like a wellness wheel, can be financial, emotional, physical, social. I think it's important that we don't just think of this cognitively, but also in our hearts, DRC. And so thinking about really what is the impact on these policies and on these institutions that we are a part of. So financial lack of funds, the inability to invest, what we were just talking about, emotional. There's this great report out of the McSilver Institute in New York at NYU, which is called The Trauma of Racism, that really unpacks the psychological trauma, the physical trauma of all of this. And physical, so we talked a little bit about health, safety, the impacts of incarceration on physical health, and then social. So also what this can mean for our networks, either at home or also professionally in the workplace. So this is kind of a national broad stroke. This is what racial inequity can look like. And then locally, why are we caring about it here in Washtenaw County is because it exists here. And so we have racial inequity here in our county. And what we are well known for are some really wonderful things. This arrow, this left side is showing us that there are some really awesome things about our county. For example, we're like #1 in the state for health factors. We have an incredible health system, multiple here. Ann Arbor is the #1 educated city in America. Holy cow. Great for tech grads, housing market, green cities, and the #1 city for millennials. So lots of good things are going on, but the problem is that that's not actually happening for everyone. And we have to be careful when we celebrate maybe what are some things that are going well, that we also acknowledge that maybe it's not going well for everyone, or that there's also other things that are going on that we need to name and address. So this is to show that while some good stuff is going on, there's also really negative experiences and outcomes that are happening. So the first one is showing us that we are 80 out of 83 for income inequality in the state. So, or I guess reframed would be like we're the 4th worst in terms of income inequality. The racial gap of more is more than 30 to 40 points in student test scores. Ann Arbor is the 8th most economically segregated city. We have the most expensive rental market in Michigan, which would make housing really unaffordable for many. And then also, like we were talking about with this upward income mobility, so the ability to move up, right, and to gain assets and all of that, that we're in bottom 8% for that, for people who are lower class to be able to move up as they may need.
Are these state figures or national?
State, this is all compared to state, yeah, or within the county. So, and I have other data too that I can pull up if you're interested. So how this all kind of came to be is that 2 departments in particular, well, 3 have been doing some really great work around this. OCED, so the Office of Community and Economic Development within the county, has been doing really, has been naming this and trying to address racial inequity. Also, the Department of Health, they have on their website, they have a whole page that's devoted to this, and they have a whole initiative to this. And then the Sheriff's Office has also been doing work with implicit bias with their officers. So in 2015, backing it up a few years, OCD released this housing affordability and economic equity analysis, which really named how segregated both racially and economically our county is, and that it's actually getting worse. So we're not staying the same. If our housing rental, and it's great for millennials, is going up, then that means that it's having an impact, and it might be displacing other people, or it might be making housing inaffordable. The Washtenaw County Opportunity Index, which is this really cool tool that I highly recommend that people check out. It is like a data mapping tool where you can look to see where in our county is highest to lowest areas for opportunity. So here's an example of part of what it can show us. So this is to show that jobs, this is Ann Arbor and this is the Ypsi area. We're seeing that thousands of jobs are being created in Ann Arbor, University of Michigan being one of those employers. But then there's a deficit of jobs in the Ypsilanti area. And so if people aren't getting jobs and aren't able to access that income, then of course that also has a direct impact on all parts of our lives. So then there was, so this came out and people are like, we now have data to show us that actually what is really happening in our county. It's actually not getting better. It's not, in some areas it's staying the same, but actually in some areas that disparity is getting bigger. So then there was an equity summit where over 300 people attended. That included like staff leadership, it included nonprofit folks, it included community members, elected officials. It was a conglomerate of people to talk about this and to kind of say this is what is happening in our county, what do we think we should do? In 2016, that moved into a conversation at a Board of Commissioners meeting where some with the elected officials and then also with the county staff, bless you, to talk about how this is something that we need to name and we need to start working on it. So here begins, you know, kind of more of the conversation at a top level about administrative, broad level about racial equity. There was a conversation about an ordinance. So with the aim being that if we adopt an ordinance, which many other municipalities have done around the country, then we can embed it into our institution by making it a part of our decision-making processes. So really making it a part of the fabric of our institution. This conversation kind of led to lots of different questions and the reality that actually people have a very different understanding of what racial equity is. They have a very different level of how to talk about it. And so that came into a conversation about bringing in an external organization to come in and to support what that work would look like. So, hello, welcome. So, the Government Alliance on Race and Equity is the name of the group, of the organization that we've been working with now over the past year. And I'll flip back to that other slide, but I just want to pop this slide in here about GARE. So GARE is a national network of government that's working to achieve racial equity and advance opportunities for all in government across the country. They have, I believe the number is right now, like 198 jurisdictions that they work with. And this is really exciting because they have been growing very quickly, which is showing that actually this is both not only urgent work, but that this is work that institutions are saying like, oh, we have both perpetuated this. Sometimes these policies have actually been in our institutions. They still exist, right, unintentionally or implicitly, and we want to do something about it. So they have created this awesome network. I love the GARE network. All the time I'm like calling people from different cities and counties to get advice about what we should do here so that we don't recreate the wheel. And this is some of their principles. So the focus is racial equity. The idea is to build organizational capacity. They have tools that we should be using, and in particular racial equity tools, because if we just use tools, often this is like a GARE thing, if you just use tools without an anti-racist lens or a racial equity lens, then you can still be perpetuating what's already happening, thinking that we're doing better, but if we don't actually have the data or if we don't apply that lens, we may not actually be doing what we're hoping, what our intentions are. We want to be data-driven, exactly what I was just saying. Partner with other institutions, so building that network is key so that we're not in isolation doing it, but instead we have a larger community that's working on this together. And then operating with urgency and accountability. So while this has been, this has been happening for hundreds of years, it's massive, it can feel daunting, and it is urgent that we address it. People's lives are being directly impacted by this in a variety of ways. And we must be accountable to community members, and particularly residents of color, and particularly to how their lives are improving. And so we need to also make sure that this isn't just siloed within our institution, but that we're having dialogue and holding ourselves accountable to both data and people. So the Michigan Department of Civil Rights is also a GARE member. And there are about 3 other, I think, areas in Michigan. So Grand Rapids, Ottawa, and who's the third that I'm missing? I think Kalamazoo is beginning to have those conversations.
Kalamazoo is beginning to, and Jackson is
Yes.
beginning to.
Yes, and so we are hoping that potentially also that maybe the state of Michigan folks, that we can get together so that we can also start building together, learning if there's state policy that is impacting our institutions, how can we maybe change that kind of conversation, which I'm excited about. So to throw it back here, so that's GARE. So we've been working with them since last year. So in 2017, GARE came to a Board of Commissioners working session to talk to them about who they are, what kind of work they do, what is racial equity, why is it important to Washtenaw County. Then it went into a county, the next day presented to county department heads, including Ann Arbor leadership. And then later, the next day, they met with the Board of Commissioners, the elected officials, city council, and then other leadership from other municipalities. July 12th, a month later, the Board of Commissioners passed a resolution to affirm the commitment to racial equity work. So not an ordinance, so it's not changing policy, but just a resolution that says we want to work on this and we are now naming this as a priority. Yes.
So I think you mentioned the number 190. Was that 190 governments or is that 190 NAACP and
So I would say, they say 198 partners. I would believe that probably like 90% plus are government, but they have
100%.
Oh, well, they have some, maybe it's like 98% or something, because I know that they're also working with some health systems, they're also working with a nonprofit in New York.
Okay,
Yeah.
but mostly government.
Yes, mostly government, that's their aim, but they've had also a lot of requests from like nonprofits and other people saying like, we want to do this, help us. So I think that they're kind of making they're working out, how to branch out the great tools and stuff they have. Hi, Lori. Welcome. Oops. Yeah, no, that's right. So 2015, kind of the beginnings of the conversation, 2016, awareness of like, actually, we need to learn more before we can actually do this. Just like I said, part of talking about racism is that many of us have not actually been taught to talk about how to talk about racism or how to even understand what is racial equity. It's something that we often don't name. So how do we name that and how do we begin to normalize that and learn about it? And that's when GARE was brought in as experts on this and expert educators and facilitators to assist the county in being able to start this work more actively. Yeah.
And are there costs to this, to participating with GARE?
Yes. So we have a contract with them, and the city of Ann Arbor split that. So they have paid half of it, and then we paid the other half.
We being the county,
Yeah.
the commissioners?
Yep. And part of why there's a question of like, well, why the city of Ann Arbor? And part of that is because their leadership was on board from the beginning and also having the financial resources to contribute to that. We are planning this summer, which I'll talk a little bit about, to like expand that partnership so that's not just Ann Arbor and the county. Yes.
So you've shown us that at the very last of the last slide, the affirmation that came from
The
county
resolution.
commissioners and the city and all. What kind of affirmation? Are you going to be telling us what that means, that they affirmed it? Did they commit any funds? Did they make any timetable? Did they put anybody on it?
No, I wish I had the resolution with me. So my understanding is that it was more just about like naming this as a priority. An ordinance is in the work. Tomorrow evening I'm presenting to the Board of Commissioners about an ordinance.
Which you have developed, or
Which
they have?
a commissioner has developed.
Okay.
Yes. And so, which was originally discussed a couple years ago, but that's when there was like understanding, that's when it came to light of actually like, whoa, there's a spectrum of understanding of racial equity among leadership, among commissioners, among residents, and we need to actually learn much more before we can make such a large action by so many people. So the resolution really was just to name, like, this is a priority. It wasn't about, it didn't say number of funds, it didn't say staff, it didn't say anything detailed like that. But the ordinance hopefully will. So that's GARE. So now here we are in the year 2018. And so this is just this past January is the beginning of what is being called One Community. So like, as I already shared, that title was Advancing Racial Equity in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County, but we've now taken out Ann Arbor because Ann Arbor's in Washtenaw County and because we're hoping to build out those partnerships, so really it's just all-encompassing. I'm going to show just a little video, a little marketing video that will help describe the process, and I recommend you all sharing it with your friends and family. I was having lunch with some people the other day and showed it to them in the middle of our lunch. I think we have time for this. Is this okay? Are people curious to see this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, great.
Somebody get the lights.
Sound? Let's check sound. Come on, little mouse. Thanks, Miles.
And we're fortunate in Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County to have a lot of shared values. We have values of fairness, inclusion, plurality, openness. These are some of our core values. We have a long history of living by these values. So, it goes back to stories we hear about the Underground Railroad in our community.
In World War II, for instance, when you think of Rosie the Riveter, you're thinking of a Washtenaw County resident.
During the 60s and 70s, we had SDS growing the Black Action Movement teach-ins. In the city, we have a human rights ordinance that dates back to the 1970s.
The University of Michigan, first major university, actually have an LGBT office dedicated to those individuals.
These are things that we look back at with pride, even though we...
Oh, that's good.
For the people of Washtenaw County and for the people of the city of Ann Arbor, these values are core to what they expect in local and county government.
Well, government should care about equity because it is an opportunity to provide a voice for those who may not be able to be heard.
We've always talked about working within a framework that is aligned with community values. This is an excellent opportunity to do that.
The name of the initiative is One Community, Advancing Racial Equity throughout Ann Arbor and Washtenaw County.
We get all these amazing awards for a great quality of life, the fantastic community we have, and we've earned them, we deserve them.
Things like the most educated city in the nation, the best public schools in the state. I mean, there are so many accolades that we as a city and a county receive.
But there's another side, and that's the side that not everybody's getting a chance to get the most out of this great quality of life. Washtenaw County, we're the 8th most economically segregated metropolitan region in the country.
In our state, there are 83 counties. Unfortunately, our county, out of those 83, is 80th in terms of economic inequity, and again, the ability to move upward, economically speaking.
The truth is that sometimes government has been responsible for throwing obstacles in the way of that equality throughout our community.
Government has had a very long and historical role in continuing and perpetrating and perpetuating inequity and disparity.
When you look back at the property records, in the deeds that people were given for their home, there were racially restricted covenants. People of color, African Americans, were prohibited from living in some of our areas, in some of our neighborhoods.
When we think about redlining, where folks who had different skin colors were not allowed access to mortgages or money to buy houses.
And when we were keeping people out of those neighborhoods, out of those places where they could build wealth, that still affects generations later.
There are many examples throughout our history where our government has decided who is a person, who can vote, who can own property, who has access to different things, and those things play out in the different ways in our communities, again, in terms of access to education, to jobs, to housing, to healthcare, and those policies matter.
We're not a post-racial society, but the other thing is, I don't know that we want to be a post-racial society.
We are very much in a racial society. We can't ignore the things that exist.
I think, for me as somebody, my dad's side of the family is Polish, my mom's side is German, that heritage, that history, that matters to me. So I want us to celebrate the diversity we have in this community and enrich it, but not have that diversity determine people's outcomes.
So I like to think about this in terms of developing a toolbox for the organization stakeholders, ensuring that they have the tools and resources and the skills and training necessary to advance the initiative.
The initiative starts with an education program, making sure that the leaders of our governments are aware of the places where inequity exists, either intentionally or unintentionally. It means listening to our community. It commits ourselves to a continued process of education and learning and a constant review of how we deliver services throughout our community.
So, after this initial phase, the educational phase, I think we have an opportunity to craft a way forward that has equity for us in its DNA, equity in services and programs that we move forward, equity in our hiring practices, equity in our service delivery model, and how we interact with not just the public, but with our community partners.
If the question is what comes after learning, I think you start with the premise that learning never stops. After the first sessions we have with GARE, that'll help us develop the toolkit that will enlighten us to the areas where inherent bias exists, is that as we make adjustments, we look at how those adjustments have impacts, we come back, we evaluate, we assess, and we continually learn on how we can improve the delivery of services.
So the involvement will include staff, administrators, the board of commissioners, community partners, the city council. It is all the key leadership in our community, and I think that's one of the exciting components of this. We'd like to invite everyone in Washtenaw County to join us in creating a just and equitable community for all.
Yay! So that is an overview of the initiative. I want to share with you really quickly that you can find this video on the One Community website. So it's the link is actually ONECMTY. So it's an abbreviation of community.org. And then when you open it, it'll pop up to Opportunity Washtenaw. But the home screen is over here, and you can see down here this video. This is the video link. So a short video about it if you want to share it with your friends. And then also I wanted to just show you quickly that there's a link here called Equity Updates, which is under the Learn section. So you can learn stuff here. The opportunity indexes here, more information and stats about how inequities are showing up in our community are here. What? Oh no. Shoot. There's little worker people. Okay, never mind. I was going to show you my really cool newsletter that just came out, which apparently is having some technical issues. So I take that back. Anyway, that's the website. And you can get there too from the county website, which we are working on linking.
I have just a tiny little question.
Sure.
To what extent are you educating the candidates for county commissioners on this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure of any very explicit education for the candidates in particular. I know that tomorrow, I know that actually GARE both has done their Intro to Racial Equity, and then also there was a presentation done by the OCED about racial equity last year to the current Board of Commissioners, and tomorrow I'm presenting there more about the inequities and also the work.
Where is your presentation tomorrow?
It is at here. It's at LRC at 6:30. And yes, there's 2 presentations on the agenda, and we're the first one. And
that's for the county board? with
Yep.
county commissioners?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the working
But the
session.
candidates can come right to that.
Sure, yeah, and I would think that that's really great also for us as residents. What questions do we ask the candidates? I'm not sure, I think it's kind of more self-initiated on their end than us doing active like education for them.
Oh, trust me, it's not going to be self-initiated on their end. I'm just going to twist arms.
Yes, or it's up to us residents. Yes, exactly. So this initiative has now started this past January, and GARE has a model. It's called normalizing and operationalizing and organizing. So the first step is to normalize, which is what the Intro to Racial Equity is and all these trainings that I will talk about. And then to operationalize means that how do we actually put this into our tools and our systems, and then to organize, which is how do we get everyone involved, right, from staff people to elected officials to community members, so that it's this cycle that we are always working on, and it encompasses both the depth of our institutions. So we are not just talking about leadership, we're talking about from literally all staff, so depth of the hierarchy, but then also breadth. So all departments are a part of this.
Including the courts, Anna?
Yes, including the courts. So there is, I don't have it on here. So there's the team that's kind of leading this right now is called the Action Team. And it is representatives from OCED and Health, since they've been two of the greatest leaders. But that's the meeting that I have to run to after this, and we have 3 new folks, representatives. So Derek Jackson from the Sheriff's Office, Delphia Simpson from Public Defenders, and then also Linda Edwards-Brown as the Juvenile Court. So everyone is a part of it, but that's going to be kind of our action team, which I'm really excited about because it both holds a lot of expertise and people who have already been doing this in their own departments, and then it also holds some of our departments that are having the greatest impact on residents of color. Yes?
When you say the courts are included, you mentioned juvenile. Is it just juvenile or?
No, everyone is. All departments are a part of it.
And do you know how specifically they are included?
So so I can talk a little bit about that. So what has happened so far this year is that I've been hired, which is great because that's showing investment, right? And it's showing we care about this. We're going to hire a full-time person for it just till November. In case anyone has a job for me after. Yeah, exactly. It will not be solved by November, I can guarantee that. We've administered a survey to all county staff, except the Sheriff's Department, who does their own implicit bias work, hasn't taken it yet as they work out how that'll align with their work. So about 432 people took that, which is about 50% of the staff. And so that was just to get a baseline assessment of what is the staff's general sense of racial equity so that we can better do our work. So that we can see, is it that people are feeling not supported and they need more tools, or is it that people have no idea what racial equity is and are really uncomfortable, what's going on, so that we can, tailor it accordingly. Trainings. There have been 7 different trainings that GARE has already provided us just this year. And so the top leadership, back to your question, all department heads and managerial, mid to high management has been invited to those, including other folks that department heads feel are invested and want to learn this work. So that has included all department heads. So that is from the prosecutor's office to courts and every other department.
Was it mandatory? Or?
Not mandatory, highly encouraged, trying to create, a culture of...
You may have mentioned this, I didn't hear it. Where are the schools?
The schools, since they are not a part of, since they're not a department, it's a great question, and we talk a lot about them because you can't have this conversation just in isolation, obviously. We are hoping that this summer, actually, the Washtenaw Intermediate School District in particular is really interested in this conversation. And so we're hoping to build out those partnerships, and we're going to start with those who have been most vocal and interested so that we can start to build kind of a group and hopefully a mass that will eventually, get others involved.
You don't get anywhere without an active, meaningful buy-in from the school system.
Mm-hmm.
Because those, in the school system, decisions are made every day
Yeah.
that have an impact on social and racial equity.
Mm-hmm.
And many times, they don't even understand it.
Yes. Yeah.
Most of the time, they don't understand it.
Yeah, I hear that. And I think that the one of the greatest priorities or focus right now is to do the kind of internal work. So we are looking internally at our own policies, our hiring policies, our promotion policies, by department, what is the racial makeup of our staff and all of that as kind of like not that it's necessarily that linear or chronological, but that's been a lot of the conversation, is to even just name what within our institution, internally, where are we seeing racial inequity and how can we move forward with that, while simultaneously going to build out kind of these external partnerships. Thank you for that. Yes.
What I see missing at the table, and maybe I don't know where they would fit, are the developers in town. In other words, in Ann Arbor, my neighborhood should be affordable housing. Mm-hmm. They are now putting units, multi-$1,000 a month for students, for undergraduate. Mm-hmm. And this is right across from Everwood. Mm-hmm. Now, come on. Mm-hmm. Who's making those decisions? Where do they fit? Mm-hmm. Who controls them? Mm-hmm. They seem to have run away with this community.
Yep. So I think that's a really great question, and I have a few responses to that. One is that I don't know personally who is responsible or exactly how that works per se, but what I do know is that when leadership is making decisions, whether it's the city or it's the county or other jurisdictions, hopefully what will happen is that whoever is in relationship with those contractors will now have a racial equity lens that's able to say, actually, if we do this, that might have this inequitable impact, which is not what we are normally taught or what we are encouraged to be thinking, right? So that would be part of the intervention point. And that is also we're not just relying on them to open their awareness around racial equity. We will also be embedding certain policies and processes institutionally, so in our institutions, that will actually have points of question, like, is this decision racially equitable? Here are the 4 ways that you can show us. Show us the data. How is this going to better the residents of color in that area, or whatever? So you're speaking, that is a perfect example, because hopefully we should be able to build systems around that would help us to identify if that is actually a good opportunity for everyone or not. And I'll talk a little more about that as we talk about a couple things here.
How would you enforce that? If they don't meet those criteria, how do you enforce that? Do you give them fines? Do you arrest them? What do you do?
First, we have to get the criteria there and accept it. Can I ask if you are trying to make some kind of a chart or information about where we are right now with all the departments and organizations you're working with? They probably have some either intentions or plans, like the Sheriff's Department. I'm sure they have some, you mentioned that. And every one of the groups that you meet with, is all of that going to be put together so we see where this organization, where our county is right now, and what people are currently saying that they're addressing, so we can start seeing if they're making progress? Yes,
totally. And actually, maybe I can run through these upcoming plans because it speaks to both those questions.
Where is the university involved here? I've been watching development in Ann Arbor for several decades, and you can't ignore the university. And answering by the way part of your question, as long as the university wants to attract international students, we provide for high-cost housing because they come to the university, pay high tuitions, and get plugged into this new high-cost housing. Where is the university? If you met with them, they like to think in terms of being progressive, but they also have a mission, and the mission oftentimes is in conflict with this recognition of inequities in the city.
Well, you can't ignore them, but they can ignore you.
That's totally true, John. So we have not spoken with them directly about this. Ginsburg has asked that myself and Commissioner Felicia Braybeck do a presentation actually for some university leaders at the end of June. But my understanding, so kind of is that this links back to the question of how do we develop this and expand this. Right now we're just kind of, right, we're beginning to just even normalize the conversation around race, right, and racism and racial equity. That's huge, right? Otherwise walls are put up, otherwise people are interpreting other things, otherwise people get defensive and want to talk about gender equity and all these other types of equity, which is obviously great. And research shows that if we start doing like a breadth of equity work that the outcomes don't change, which is why we name one equity, particularly racial equity, and go with it. So the idea is that we first are just learning, we're naming this as even an issue, we're learning about it, we want to work institutionally, internally with ourselves, then we're going to expand it to more jurisdictions, and then other sectors. So we've been talking about where's the private sector, we've been talking about where are the universities. So I see that we were just talking about this these past couple weeks. One thing that I think, and obviously there's some tension there, and in some ways the university is really great and a huge asset, and in other ways it can conflict with some of our priorities. What I'm grateful for at the university that I'm hoping we can latch onto is that they have an initiative that's called the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiative, DE&I, that started about 2 years ago, and they have about 78 different departments that have their own offices, DE&I offices. Some have full-time staff, some are just volunteer time, some are written in people's job descriptions, or in their work plans, I should say. And so I'm hoping that could also be a conversation. It's like DE&I isn't just about for your university, it's about the location and the community that your university is situated in. So hopefully we'll get some traction with that. So some of the upcoming plans, which then we can open it up for more conversation, is that, like I said, tomorrow I will be presenting with the commissioner about a draft ordinance. That ordinance is way more clear, Joan, to your point about what exactly is it asking. It's asking that we embed a racial equity lens into our decision-making processes, which I'll get into more. It's saying that we would like a racial equity office with personnel and resources that I can say more about. And it is also just naming it, so it's affirming again that this is a priority of ours. So hopefully that'll be at the working session tomorrow, and then hopefully it'll be voted on in August.
County ordinance or city ordinance?
County ordinance. Mm-hmm. The quadrennial budget is up this summer/fall. I think September is when that'll be fully decided on. So that is the county's budget that happens in a 4-year cycle. And one thing that they have been implementing an equity lens. Again, this is a new conversation, so I think it has lots of room for growth. But in general, there's conversations around equity, and actually I just submitted this past week a proposal for the Racial Equity Office, and in the form that you have to fill out, there are 4 questions about equity. Like, how does this advance it? What are your outcomes going to be? So that is a perfect example of how the budget team has said, we need to embed this in our institutions. We need to make sure that people can tell us exactly how this advances racial equity, and we will take that information to then decide where we fund, how we fund.
So that will be part of their applications for funding.
Yep, so yes, and those have already been submitted. So now this month, the budget team will get together, they'll see all of those requests, and then they'll see where does it, it's a little complicated because we don't have all the data yet, and sometimes data is either out in the ether or data hasn't been disaggregated by race and other, hasn't been split up so that we don't know. So again, it's all new, but the point is that that's a great example, and it's so cool to see that this group of people are like, we care about this and we want to do something about this, so let's try this.
Also, it forces those who have to fill out that budget and take their budget. They're beginning to think, not only because someone has contacted me with some specific questions to answer those questions. It was just an interesting moment of, gosh, I got to think about my request, my budget request through this lens and have some very good answers in order to increase the probability of getting funded. So it's there, and I think I had that experience probably 6 to 8 weeks ago. So
yes.
It's been around, and people are, stopping in their tracks to say, "Oh my!"
Yes.
I have to think about the scope of the work that I'm doing.
Yep.
And how it's impacting people, the larger community, and who's coming through my doors, and those kinds of things.
Yep. Exactly.
It was a pleasant surprise.
Yeah. Oh, that warms my heart. A department reached out to me and they were like, "This is due, and we don't know what this means." Yeah. So we had a 2-hour meeting, and it was great, especially because it wasn't a department that directly serves people. So they're thinking well, we don't directly serve people, we don't have those numbers. So they are in a really interesting position to say, okay, well, if we're committed to this, then how do we have our processes ask other departments that we serve, how is this going to be racially equitable? So it was a perfect opportunity to actually, like, it forces us to create space and time to actually have these conversations to think about how to change our systems. So that was an exciting moment and a really good, tangible way to see how the work can happen. The racial equity plan, so to the question that was earlier asked here about what the courts are doing. So each department, on our last training last week on May 30th, we began to map out. Actually, it wasn't by department, I'll tell you. It was by working group, which I'll say more. But they began to map out what would an action plan, a racial equity action plan, look like for that group. So what is, and that might even be like, well, we can't really do this until we have the data, you know? So our first step is actually to get the data, to do some analysis, and then the next step might be to create processes to know, you know, how do we change these outcomes. So those working groups were created at a GARE training back in February, and it was actually by topic. So it was like new hires, you know, HR, new incoming processes, courts, or criminal justice and policing, housing, affordability, economic development. So it's actually multidisciplinary teams, which I think is actually super cool because these issues are so complex. And I think that's sometimes often what happens is that sometimes people in the department, like the department I just was at, was like, well, we can't do anything about that. But it's a problem that is impacting their work. And so it was like, oh, that's a perfect time where actually, that's right, this is a multidisciplinary, multi-departmental issue and concern, and so the more that we talk about it, we can see who else can we bring into the room so that we can have a, you know, a multiple approach instead of just a department saying, well, that's not our area of concern. And we've seen actually, or I've seen over the course of the months, people saying like, well, that's not my job, or that's not my department's thing, and then actually later being like, wait, yes it is. We can do something about that if we think creatively or if we use our resources in a different way. So it's very cool to see.
In the court watching program that was run last year, we were very frustrated by not being able to get data from the courts. So this may inspire them for putting together some data?
Yes.
Possible?
Yes, I hope it is.
You're going to meet with Linda Edwards Brown.
Yep, I am. And so that's exactly right. One of my next steps is to reach out actually to department heads and say, what data exists for you and in what format, because we need to start to centralize it. And Joan, to your point, my hope is that it'll be centralized and we'll all be using it in a similar way to then create graphics, like visualizations of dashboards where we can say, like, the courts want to change these 3 things over the next 5 years, and we are going to see how they're doing on those. You know, they will self-assess, or we will assess, or the equity office will assess, or whatever, and that should be open to the public. You all should be able to go to the One Community website and see how each department is doing. So those equity plans are, you know, the May 30th training was just a beginning to even understanding the idea of what does it look like to map this out. But I'm hoping that they will become 3 to 5 year plans that people really are held accountable for. And to your question, I'm hoping that it's not punitive-based accountability, but it's sort of instead restorative accountability. And that will be up to, I think, the equity office and other leadership, which I can talk about. Actually, I'll go ahead and jump there. So the equity office, I must have talked to I think I probably got information from 20 different offices around the country about their staff structure. So how many staff do they have? What are their titles? What are their job descriptions? I probably talked to 6 different directors. There's more than those 20 across the country. Something that's great about GARE is that they have these working groups themselves, and one of those working groups are racial equity offices, and so I can consult with other people to say what's working for you, what's not, how do we build this out. So I just put in my strategic investment form for staff for over the course of 4 years, because it's quadrennial budget. And the idea being that staff would be leading, would be continually leading this work, and hopefully they would be the ones overseeing the action plans and holding people accountable. I'm not sure what that'll look like. I think that will be some pretty, I'd imagine, heavy, serious conversations. And I'm really hopeful that, because that's exactly right, you can totally have an office and without actually, you can have an office and still outcomes may not change. So it's key that actually there's a lot of transparency, that residents are really well informed, and that there are structures of accountability. I have a lot of hope that the right folks will be in that office, and that and I think the GARE model is really wise to say actually that this is about depth and breadth. This is not just an office's task or mission. This is the entire institution. Everyone is a part of this. It doesn't matter what your job is. This is all part of our duty as staff in this institution is to care about this. And I think our leadership is saying that, but that is also a GARE serious, principle that needs to be happening across the board. Otherwise, not one or two people can carry racial equity for the county. Did you see him?
I don't know if you might have mentioned it, step out. Sure. But did you know about the initiative that the 15th District Court, the Ann Arbor Court, and the Washtenaw County Bar Association are trying to get together? They had one meeting thus far about a month and a half ago on implicit bias and how that affects us. And they're going to repeat it. I don't know if it's already been repeated or not, but I did get the name of the president of the Bar Association is Orlando Simon. And I was just thinking about all the work that you're doing with the county and the city, and some of that probably could support each other.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I haven't heard about that. I'd love to hear about that.
The 20th century, the catchword was equality. And the 21st century is going to be equity. There are differences.
Yes.
You can legislate equality, and then you legislate it almost to death in the 20th century. I don't know that you can legislate equity. It's something that has to grow, and has to be nurtured, and it has to be learned individually, but you've got a project.
Yes. Yeah, and I appreciate that the difference between equality and equity. Because I think that's right, is that the equality was kind of the dominant narrative around that, and now we're seeing actually it's not just an equal distribution of resources. It needs to be equitably done, given historical context, current landscape, all of that. That is actually, to that point, the ordinance, oh, we're not, I see, sorry, we're not in the viewing. So our, some of our governmental practices were explicitly racist, and that moved into race-neutral policies, but that still, like you said, doesn't actually make our society equal. We still have inequitable outcomes. And so this is to say that we actually have to intervene. We have to intervene, not just intentionally, not just have intentions of changing it, or not just talking about it, but we have to put practices into our structures to intervene it. So an ordinance, is a policy, that is a policy change, and hopefully it is a way for us to, which is obviously very complicated when we're supposed to have race-neutral policies and when people don't want to talk about racism and all of that. But I think it is a small way, at least, to try to get it into some legislation.
I was going to say, I understand the comment also that was made over there. Also, those kinds of things were said about the laws that try to bring about equality. Initially, it's like you just can't legislate that, but it had to start somewhere.
Yes.
If there weren't any laws there, then we would probably still be doing things with all the liberal seed.
Right. Yes. So I think, let me just see what these other bullet points were. The two last things that I was just going to share is a little more about just that this is a newer initiative, so working on communications and the structure for it. So I was just excited about my newsletter. I was going to say bragging, but I wasn't trying to brag. It's not that cool of a newsletter. But excited, yes, but I have one. But excited to actually start making this something that people are talking about, people can easily access, going to create a hashtag for the millennials. And also that the structure is that we have an action team right now, but we're also building out other teams within the department that'll get to that depth and breadth that I was talking about. And then eventually, hopefully, staff, where we have full-time, an office where we have full-time staff in it. And then to train the trainer is a model that Gare came in and trained both between the city and county about 25 people, staff people, to give their intro to racial equity content, to present it, to train people on it. So we are planning that, step one of Gare is to normalize. So we have a two-phase rollout that we have been designing, which is to train people in racial equity in that introduction content. So it's about a 4-hour session. So this year, we're hoping to start that in the fall. This summer, I'm going to work with those trainers to build up skills and capacity to make sure that we are producing high-quality content. And then that'll become just a regular routine where, like, every 6 weeks, we will have the training. If you're new, it's just part of it. If you're new to the city, if you're new to the county, if you're new to other jurisdictions, you go through that training. So it just really becomes a part of our culture. And people can start talking about it and being aware of the initiative. So that is, the last graphic I have is just to show some of this. It's everything I've already talked about, but just this was the budget process timeline, so the timing up here. GARE, we've been in relationship with them for this long. And then here's kind of the One Community initiative, and it's just to show that this is meant to continue forever until, or hopefully until we end racism. So,
until we have equity.
That's right. So here's my contact information. I'm sorry that I have to leave earlier than I hoped, but I have about 5 more minutes for questions or dialogue, and please feel free to reach out anytime. Yes.
You have so many things on your plate. How are you going to do community outreach and volunteer organization?
Yes, thank you, John. Community engagement is a huge one. I should totally put it on there. It is, we are working on how to, I think what I'm feeling is that I'm still trying to work out with the office, hopefully starting in January, wanting to be really smart and intentional about how we start programming while ensuring that it gets continued. I don't want to promise things to community members or ask for participation, especially if it's about storytelling, about particularly challenging topics, or or overpromise or whatever. And so I want to be really smart about how community is engaged and making sure that it can continue past my being with the office.
So you're building that into the structure of what you're trying to build now.
Yes. Yeah, but that is key. And while we are focusing internally, 100% what this is really about is residents and residents of color and their quality of life. And so that needs to be, to me, that's where our accountability measure is, and that's where it sits. So really building that out. That is very atypical to how government typically functions, or honestly how nonprofits function, or any institution really. So I think trying to build that out also as part of our culture is going to take a little bit of time and conversation and resources.
But Joanna will help with the voting.
Yes, Joanna. Thank you.
Is there any person that this is their baby and they've got it and they're going to run with it?
Yes. I would say that Greg Dill, the county administrator, I think feels like this is of utmost importance to him. So he has been a huge leader of it. The other few key leaders, I think, are that Andrea Plebick, who was the director of OCD, but recently left. She has been doing, she was a huge leader of this, and I think was really grateful. I'm glad that I was able to overlap with her, because if it is not part of your job description and you're trying to do your full-time job in addition to this, then it moves more slowly, it can get dropped, whatever. So it now feels like it's my baby, but prior to me, yes, I think that there's leadership.
Receive funding from foundations. I have some idea what the city and county budget looks like. It doesn't have room for this.
Yeah. So, yes.
At least so far.
Yeah, there's some, and I should know this better, but there's some kind of tax revenue that came in this year or something. Yeah, so actually I think there are some excess funds that were kind of not anticipated. And so that's where I think a lot of the funding will come from. But, I hear that question. And I think also what it'll look like is our maybe more affluent jurisdictions also providing, funds in order to supplement other jurisdictions' participation.
So similar question in the statement is, I'm just overjoyed that this is happening, that there's somebody like you whose job it is to make sure that this sort of thing gets into. As I really like comments, I've been wondering for years when this would finally make it to street level.
Yes.
Because the talk about understanding structural racism has been around for years and years and years and years and years. And I've often been frustrated that what exists in textbooks and in other locations has not somehow made it into common conversation. So thank goodness that this is happening. And my biggest concern is reflected in some of these statements, and it was the question that I asked at the beginning. When your job is over, what's going to happen? And where will you go? Are you going to be around here, or do you intend to stay?
I'm hoping to stay here.
Where you came from? I haven't heard of it before.
Well, I've been in Ann Arbor for 3 years. I came from the Master's of Social Work program at U of M. I used to work in the jail, here the county jail with young people, have consulted Oakland schools and restorative practices. And my hope is to also have the co-manager for the Juvenile Justice Youth Advisory Board, if you all have heard of them. My hope would be to work in that office, but who knows if that'll happen. I mean, it just matters how, obviously that would need to be a legitimate hiring system and process. So this is work that is number one to my heart, so I hope to continue that in whatever way that looks. But hopefully the office will be set up regardless of my participation, and the work will be continued.
And when trainers are trained to help with the work, do this, will they have access to this wonderful PowerPoint that is so concise and is very
Sure.
with it?
Yeah, if you all felt that was useful, I can definitely include that. Yeah.
You're actually suggesting how people should fill out their evaluations. Wonderful PowerPoint. So
Great. I have to get scooting, but I'm happy to answer any final questions. And again, please feel free to reach out to me anytime. Great.